The paper coffee cup was still warm when Marcus Chen disappeared in the mountain town of Copper Ridge, Montana, population 689. It was the night of January 8, 2010, when an early-season ice storm swept through Lewis and Clark County, coating every road leading through the mountains in glass. At 6:52 p.m., Marcus's colleague Andrea Walsh saw him leave the research station in a dark blue parka holding a coffee cup and climb into his black Dodge Ram 1500. He said he would drive to Helena before the storm got worse, a distance of just over 45 miles that he had driven hundreds of times. At 7:45, a delivery driver reported seeing his vehicle pulled over on the side of the road, headlights still on amid freezing rain and wind. The next morning, the truck was found in the exact same spot, door slightly ajar, engine cold, and no footprints around the vehicle. What happened in the 4 hours that followed would haunt Montana for more than 12 years afterward. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. In the winter of 2010, the Copper Ridge area in Lewis and Clark County, Montana was enveloped in thick ice storms and a silence so profound you could hear the branches cracking under the weight of frozen rain. The disappearance of Marcus Chen, a 34-year-old wildlife biologist, marked the beginning of a mystery that would consume the community for over a decade. What started as a missing person case during a winter storm became a 12-year investigation that would test the limits of forensic science, challenge the bonds of a tight-knit mountain community, and ultimately reveal that the most dangerous secrets are those hidden in plain sight. This is the story of how persistence, technology, and one investigator's refusal to give up brought justice to a family that never stopped searching for answers. The vanishing of Marcus Chen fractured Copper Ridge in ways that would never fully heal. In a town where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors helped neighbors survive brutal Montana winters, the idea that someone among them might know what happened was unthinkable and yet impossible to ignore. Some believed Marcus had simply gotten disoriented in the storm, wandered into the wilderness, and succumbed to the elements. Others whispered darker theories, that he'd been running from something, that his research work had made him enemies, that someone in town knew more than they were saying. Coffee shops fell silent when certain names were mentioned. Families who had been friends for generations stopped speaking. The search volunteers who had trudged through frozen forests together now avoided eye contact at the grocery store. Copper Ridge became a town divided not by what they knew, but by what they feared to discover. Tonight, we'll trace the complete journey of the Marcus Chen case from that freezing January night in 2010 to the stunning breakthrough in 2022 that finally brought answers. We'll walk through the initial search that covered hundreds of miles of frozen terrain, examine the evidence that seemed to lead nowhere, and meet the families torn apart by years of not knowing. We'll see how a case that went cold for over a decade was suddenly cracked open by advances in DNA technology that didn't exist when Marcus first disappeared. And we'll confront the devastating revelation of who was responsible, someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along, someone who had even helped search for the man he'd buried. This is a story about the power of persistence, the evolution of forensic science, and the terrible weight of secrets that some people carry for years. Prepare yourself for a journey through 12 years of investigation, heartbreak, and ultimately justice delayed but not denied. Copper Ridge, Montana sat at an elevation of 4,200 feet in the northern reaches of Lewis and Clark County, where the Continental Divide cast long shadows over valleys carved by ancient glaciers. In 2010, the town claimed 689 permanent residents, though that number swelled slightly in summer when seasonal researchers arrived for field work. The economy ran on three pillars: timber operations in the surrounding national forest, a small copper mining operation that gave the town its name, and the Montana Wildlife Research Station that employed a dozen biologists studying elk migration patterns and grizzly bear populations. Main Street consisted of 2 blocks of weathered wooden buildings: Morrison's General Store, the Copper Ridge Diner, Hal's Hardware, and the First Presbyterian Church that doubled as a community meeting hall. Most residents heated their homes with wood stoves, kept emergency supplies in their basements, and knew their neighbors not just by name but by the sound of their truck engines. This was a place where people still left doors unlocked, where a handshake meant something, where survival through Montana's brutal winters required trust and cooperation. The landscape itself was unforgiving. Dense lodgepole pine forests climbed the mountainsides, broken by rocky outcroppings and steep ravines. In winter, temperatures could drop to 20 below zero. Ice storms could coat everything in inches of frozen rain, transforming the landscape into a beautiful, treacherous crystal world. Highway 12, the main route connecting Copper Ridge to Helena, wound through mountain passes that became nearly impassable in severe weather. It was a community built on resilience, independence, and the understanding that in a place this remote, people needed each other. That unspoken contract made Marcus Chen's disappearance not just a tragedy, but a betrayal that would shake Copper Ridge to its foundation. Marcus Chen was the kind of person you remember. At 34 years old, he stood 5'11" with black hair kept short for practicality and dark brown eyes that lit up when he talked about his research. He worked as a wildlife biologist at the Montana Wildlife Research Station on the eastern edge of Helena National Forest, the kind of place where colleagues knew each other's coffee orders and field boots were more common than dress shoes. He was the heart of our research team, recalls Dr. Patricia Morrison, who directed the station. Every data set was more thorough, every field report more insightful because Marcus cared. Losing him changed us all. Marcus had moved to Copper Ridge 5 years earlier following his graduate work at the University of Montana. He'd grown up in Seattle but fell in love with the quiet rhythms of mountain life, the proximity to wilderness, the sense that his work actually mattered. On weekends, he volunteered with the local search and rescue team, his wilderness navigation skills proving invaluable. Evenings off, he taught basic ecology at the community center, showing kids how to identify animal tracks. He was saving money for a PhD program in conservation biology, keeping meticulous field notes in waterproof journals he carried everywhere. His cabin was small but reflected his personality. Topographic maps on every wall, field guides stacked by the wood stove. Photographs of grizzly bears and mountain goats he'd tracked pinned above his desk. Friends described him as methodical, passionate, sometimes too willing to work through dangerous weather. He believed in the importance of long-term ecological data, even when conditions suggested staying home. He'd been monitoring a wolf pack's winter territory, tracking their movements through GPS collars and direct observation. His dedication to the research was absolute. His colleagues joked that Marcus would track wolves through a blizzard if the data required it. On January 8, 2010, they would discover how tragically true that assessment had been. January 8, 2010 began as an ordinary Friday in Copper Ridge. Marcus arrived at the Montana Wildlife Research Station at 2:00 p.m. for his evening shift monitoring radio telemetry signals from the wolf pack's GPS collars. He was scheduled to finish data collection by 6:30 p.m., then drive home to Helena for the weekend. Security footage from the station shows him reviewing maps with colleagues, checking battery levels on field equipment, his usual focused self. At 6:47 p.m., the grainy color footage shows Marcus removing his work vest, gathering his backpack and parka, waving goodbye to the station director. He stepped into the parking lot. The camera's range ends at the door. He was never seen alive again. When Marcus didn't arrive at his apartment in Helena that night, his roommate, Kevin Ortega, tried calling his cell. The calls went straight to voicemail. Kevin assumed Marcus had stayed late for field work. It happened sometimes when the data was compelling. But when Marcus didn't show up for their Saturday morning hiking plan and still wasn't answering calls by noon, Kevin drove to Copper Ridge, growing more uneasy with each mile. Kevin arrived at Marcus's cabin around 2:00 p.m. No truck in the driveway, no smoke from the chimney. Inside, everything was as Marcus had left it, breakfast dishes in the sink, research notes spread across the table, his weekend bag still unpacked in the bedroom. Kevin called the research station. They confirmed Marcus had left the previous evening, heading to Helena. By 3:30 p.m., Kevin had called the Montana Highway Patrol. By 5:00 p.m., they'd begun searching Highway 12. The Montana Highway Patrol received Kevin Ortega's missing person report at 5:12 p.m. on Saturday, January 9th, nearly 24 hours after Marcus Chen had last been seen. Trooper Daniel Vasquez, stationed in Helena, took the initial call and immediately recognized the severity. A wildlife biologist missing in winter weather. Last seen driving during an ice storm, this was no routine delayed arrival. Vasquez contacted the Lewis and Clark County Sheriff's Office, which had jurisdiction over Copper Ridge. Sheriff Raymond Martinez mobilized 2 patrol units immediately, despite fading daylight and deteriorating road conditions. Highway 12 stretched nearly 50 miles between Copper Ridge and Helena, winding through mountain passes and dense forest. If Marcus's truck had gone off the road during the ice storm, it could be anywhere. The first responding deputies, Christine Yates and Marcus Sullivan, began a systematic drive-through just after 6:00 p.m. using spotlights to scan both sides of the highway. Visibility was poor, fresh snow had fallen overnight, potentially covering any evidence. They documented every turnout, every side road, every place a vehicle might have pulled over or lost control. At 7:23 p.m., they discovered Marcus Chen's black Dodge Ram 1500 parked at an odd angle on the shoulder of Highway 12, approximately 18 miles from Copper Ridge. The location was remote, no houses, no businesses, just dense forest on both sides. The truck's headlights were off, but when Deputy Yates approached, she noticed the driver's door was slightly ajar, ice crystals forming along the gap. She radioed the discovery immediately. Within minutes, Sheriff Martinez was en route with additional units and a request for the Montana Department of Justice Division of Criminal Investigation to be notified. This was no longer just a missing person case. This was something else entirely. By Sunday morning, January 10th, the Marcus Chen case had escalated from local missing person to potential federal investigation. The FBI's Billings resident agency was notified due to the proximity to federal forest land and the possibility that Marcus's disappearance might be connected to his federal research work. Special Agent Michael Torres, who specialized in cases involving federal employees and wilderness disappearances, was assigned as liaison. The FBI brought resources the local sheriff's office simply didn't have: access to national missing persons databases, forensic specialists trained in wilderness recovery, behavioral analysts who could develop victimology profiles, and coordination with the U.S. Forest Service for large-scale search operations on federal land. Agent Torres arrived in Copper Ridge on Sunday afternoon, bringing 2 additional agents and a mobile command unit. The involvement triggered a multi-agency coordination structure. The Lewis and Clark County Sheriff's Office maintained primary jurisdiction, but now worked in concert with the Montana Highway Patrol, Montana Department of Justice, DCI, FBI, and U.S. Forest Service. A command post was established at the Copper Ridge Community Center, maps of the area covering every wall, radio channels coordinating different search teams. For Marcus's family and friends, the FBI's involvement brought both relief and terror. Relief that the full weight of federal resources would be applied to finding him. Terror at what that level of response implied about the seriousness of his disappearance. Agent Torres held a briefing that evening, his message carefully measured. "We're bringing everything we have to find Marcus Chen. This is now a priority case for multiple agencies." The search was about to expand in ways Copper Ridge had never seen. The initial search for Marcus Chen began within hours of discovering his abandoned truck, but the scope and intensity would grow exponentially over the following weeks. On that first night, Saturday, January 9th, deputies established a perimeter around the Dodge Ram and conducted preliminary sweeps of the immediate area using flashlights and thermal imaging. They found nothing: no footprints leading away from the vehicle, no signs of struggle, no blood. No evidence Marcus had ever exited the truck into the frozen landscape. By Sunday morning, the search radius expanded to a quarter-mile circle around the vehicle location. Lewis and Clark County Search and Rescue mobilized 15 volunteers, many of whom knew Marcus personally from his own search and rescue work. They moved through the dense pine forest in grid patterns, calling his name, listening for responses, checking ravines and creek beds where someone disoriented might have wandered. The temperature hovered around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, ice coated every surface. Visibility in the forest was limited, thick tree cover blocking what little winter sunlight penetrated the clouds. Monday brought reinforcements. The Montana Department of Justice provided additional personnel and a helicopter equipped with infrared sensors capable of detecting body heat. The aerial search covered a 5-mile radius, focusing on areas ground teams couldn't easily access: steep ravines, rocky outcroppings, dense undergrowth. The helicopter flew systematic patterns from dawn to dusk, but the thick forest canopy made thermal imaging nearly useless. If Marcus was beneath the trees, he was invisible from above. Tuesday saw the arrival of specialized cadaver dogs from Missoula. These highly trained animals could detect human remains even under snow and ice. Handlers worked the dogs in sectors, starting from the truck and moving outward in widening spirals. The dogs showed interest in several locations but never gave the definitive alert that indicated a body. Searchers dug through snow at each indication point, finding nothing but rocks, fallen logs, or natural depressions. By the end of the first week, over 200 volunteers had participated, covering approximately 25 square miles of rough terrain. They'd searched every accessible area within a realistic walking distance of Marcus's truck. They checked hunting cabins, abandoned mine shafts, Forest Service roads, and countless miles of wilderness trails. Media coverage brought more volunteers, people from Helena, Great Falls, even Missoula driving hours to help search. The Copper Ridge Diner served as an unofficial volunteer center, providing free coffee and meals to exhausted searchers. But as January became February and February became March, the reality set in. The search area was simply too vast, the terrain too unforgiving. Winter conditions made recovery operations increasingly dangerous. By mid-March, official search operations were scaled back to periodic sweeps of priority areas. By April, when snow began melting and conditions improved, searches resumed with renewed hope. Maybe the thaw would reveal what winter had hidden. It revealed nothing. By summer 2010, the active search had effectively ended. The case remained open, but the massive mobilization of resources ceased. Marcus Chen's black Dodge Ram had been towed to an evidence facility. His cabin remained exactly as he'd left it, preserved by his landlord who refused to rent it to anyone else. And in Helena, his father Robert Chen waited, unable to move forward, unable to let go, unable to accept that his son had simply vanished into the Montana wilderness without a trace. The community's grief transformed into something more complicated: frustration, confusion, and the slowly growing suspicion that maybe, just maybe, they were looking in the wrong places for the wrong reasons. While search teams combed the wilderness, detectives pursued the investigative angles that missing person cases demanded. Lead investigator Sarah Hutchins, a 16-year veteran of the Montana Department of Justice Division of Criminal Investigation, took command of the case on January 11th, coordinating with Sheriff Martinez and FBI agent Torres. Sarah's methodology was systematic and exhaustive. She began with Marcus Chen's last known 72 hours, reconstructing his movements, communications, and state of mind. Phone records showed his last cell tower ping at 7:03 p.m. on January 8, consistent with his location on Highway 12 between Copper Ridge and Helena. After that, his phone went dark, either powered off or in an area with no signal common in the mountain valleys. Interviews began immediately. Sarah personally questioned everyone at the Montana Wildlife Research Station. Dr. Patricia Morrison confirmed Marcus had seemed normal that Friday, focused on his work, planning to return Monday for the weekly research meeting. Andrea Walsh, who'd seen him leave, reported nothing unusual. He grabbed his parka, said "see you Monday," and walked out. That was it. Marcus's apartment in Helena was processed as a potential crime scene, though nothing suggested violence or hasty departure. His laptop was seized and analyzed. The browsing history showed wildlife research databases, weather forecasts for Lewis and Clark County, and emails to his father about possibly visiting Seattle in March. The last email, sent Thursday night, read, "Dad, finishing up some wolf data tomorrow, talk this weekend." Financial records showed no unusual activity. Marcus's bank account had $3,247 untouched since his disappearance. His credit cards showed routine purchases: gas, groceries, outdoor equipment. The last transaction was at Morrison's General Store in Copper Ridge at 6:15 p.m. on January 8. Coffee and a protein bar, purchased 32 minutes before he left the research station. Sarah interviewed Marcus's roommate Kevin Ortega extensively. Kevin provided crucial context. Marcus had been excited about recent wolf pack data, had shown no signs of depression or distress, had made plans for their weekend hike. He was looking forward to the PhD application process, Kevin stated. He had his whole future mapped out. The investigation expanded to Marcus's personal life. Had there been conflicts, threats, romantic entanglements that might explain his disappearance? Interviews with friends revealed nothing remarkable. Marcus had dated casually but had no current relationship. He'd had no known enemies, no debts, no legal troubles. His life was by all accounts stable and forward-focused. Sarah obtained surveillance footage from every business along Highway 12 with cameras. Most had poor quality or limited range, but 2 gas stations captured Marcus's Dodge Ram driving toward Helena between 6:55 and 7:10 p.m. The vehicle appeared normal, steady speed, no erratic driving, no indication of distress. The investigation also examined Marcus's professional work. Could his wildlife research have made him a target? Had he discovered something about illegal hunting or poaching? Interviews with Forest Service rangers and fish and wildlife officers found no evidence of conflicts. Marcus's research was academic, focused on ecological patterns, nothing that would provoke violence. Witness canvassing produced the delivery driver who'd seen Marcus's truck on the shoulder around 7:45 p.m. The driver, James Holland, described the scene. Headlights on, hazards not flashing. I thought about stopping but figured it was someone checking their phone or waiting out the ice. I radioed it in because the storm was getting bad, but I didn't stop. I wish I had. Sarah created a detailed timeline, mapping every confirmed sighting, every communication. Every data point. Marcus left the research station at 6:47 p.m. He was captured on gas station surveillance at 7:08 p.m., 12 miles toward Helena. His phone pinged at 7:03 p.m. The delivery driver saw his stationary truck at 7:45 p.m., another 6 miles down Highway 12. Then, nothing. What happened in those 58 minutes between leaving the research station and being seen stationary on the highway? Why had he stopped? The road conditions were poor but not impassable. Other drivers had made the trip that night. Why was the door ajar but no footprints visible? Where was Marcus Chen? By February 2010, Sarah Hutchins had conducted 47 formal interviews, reviewed hundreds of hours of surveillance footage, analyzed phone and financial records, coordinated with federal agencies, and supervised extensive searches. She had developed no viable suspects, no clear motive for foul play, no evidence of suicide or voluntary disappearance. The case file grew thicker, but the answers remained elusive. Marcus Chen had simply vanished, leaving behind an abandoned truck, a grieving family, and a community desperately searching for explanation in the frozen Montana wilderness. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. I'm always fascinated to see how far these stories travel and how they connect us across distances. The Marcus Chen investigation confronted limitations that were both technological and practical. In 2010, forensic capabilities existed that would seem primitive just a decade later. DNA analysis was available but required substantial biological samples and could take months to process. Cell phone tracking relied on tower pings, not GPS precision. Social media was still emerging. Facebook existed, but digital footprints were minimal compared to today's constant connectivity. The Montana Department of Justice (DCI) operated with finite resources. Sarah Hutchins was managing 3 other active cases while leading the Chen investigation. The agency's budget couldn't sustain indefinite searches or round-the-clock surveillance. Crime scene processing had to be meticulous but fast, evidence storage space was limited, and the facility in Helena was already overcrowded with materials from decades of unsolved cases. Jurisdictional complexities added layers of bureaucracy. The disappearance occurred on a state highway, but adjacent federal forest land meant coordination with U.S. agencies. Evidence had to be shared across multiple departments, each with different protocols and chain of custody requirements. Database searches required formal requests, interagency agreements, and patience for systems that didn't communicate seamlessly. Weather itself was an adversary. Winter in Montana didn't pause for investigations. Temperatures regularly dropped below zero. Snow continued falling through March, potentially burying evidence that might have been recoverable in other seasons. The search area was simply too vast, thousands of acres of wilderness where a person could vanish completely. Perhaps most frustrating was the lack of digital trail. Marcus's cell phone last pinged at 7:03 p.m. and then went silent. In 2010, phones didn't continuously broadcast location data. They didn't automatically upload photos to cloud storage. They didn't leave the constant digital breadcrumbs that would become standard within years. Marcus Chen had disappeared into a gap where technology couldn't follow, where old-fashioned detective work hit walls that seemed insurmountable. Sarah Hutchins documented these limitations in her case notes, understanding that solving this case might require either extraordinary luck or technological advances that didn't yet exist. What she couldn't know was that both would eventually arrive, 12 years too late to prevent the tragedy but just in time to deliver justice. In any missing person case, investigators start with the inner circle, those closest to the victim, those who saw them last, those whose behavior might reveal knowledge or guilt. Sarah Hutchins conducted extensive interviews with everyone connected to Marcus Chen, looking for inconsistencies, nervous tells, or gaps in timelines that might indicate involvement. Dr. Patricia Morrison the research station director was interviewed 3 times. Her alibi was solid. She'd left the station at 5:30 p.m. on January 8th, drove home to Helena, and had dinner with her husband and 2 colleagues who confirmed her presence. Her relationship with Marcus was professional and positive. She expressed genuine grief and confusion about his disappearance. Nothing in her background suggested capability or motive for harm. Andrea Walsh Marcus's closest colleague at the station underwent polygraph examination at her own request. She'd been the last person to see Marcus before he left the building. The polygraph showed no deception. Her story never varied. Marcus seemed normal, focused, planning to return Monday. She'd worked late that Friday finishing reports, didn't leave the station until 9:00 p.m. and drove directly home where her roommate confirmed her arrival around 9:45 p.m. Kevin Ortega Marcus's roommate was scrutinized as someone with potential access and opportunity. But Kevin had been in Helena all evening, attending a community basketball game with 7 friends who verified his presence. His genuine distress when Marcus didn't return, his immediate action in reporting the disappearance, and his cooperation with investigators all suggested innocence rather than involvement. Thomas R. Brennan a fellow wildlife biologist at the research station, drew particular attention initially. Thomas, 42 years old, had worked at the station for 8 years and had mentored Marcus when he first arrived in Copper Ridge. Their relationship was complex. Thomas had recommended Marcus for the position, but colleagues noted occasional professional tension. Marcus's meticulous research style sometimes highlighted errors in Thomas's earlier work, creating subtle friction. Sarah interviewed Thomas on January 12th. He claimed to have left the research station around 5:00 p.m. on January 8th before Marcus departed. He drove to his home in Copper Ridge, approximately 4 miles from the station, arriving around 5:20 p.m. He spent the evening alone. His wife had died 3 years earlier. His children lived out of state. No one could verify his whereabouts between 5:20 p.m. and the next morning. Thomas volunteered for the search effort immediately, spending days in the wilderness looking for his missing colleague. He seemed devastated by Marcus's disappearance, often staying out searching long after other volunteers had called it a day. Marcus was like a son to me, Thomas told investigators. I taught him everything about fieldwork in Montana. I can't believe he's just gone. A polygraph was administered. The results were inconclusive, not clearly deceptive, but showing elevated stress responses to certain questions. When asked, "Do you know what happened to Marcus Chen?" Thomas's physiological response spiked. When asked, "Did you harm Marcus Chen?" the response was less pronounced but still notable. Sarah pushed harder in a follow-up interview. Thomas became emotional, explaining the stress responses. "Of course I'm stressed. A man I mentored, a man I cared about, is missing. I feel responsible. I should have driven him home that night. I should have checked the weather reports more carefully. Maybe if I'd offered him a ride, this wouldn't have happened." With no physical evidence, no witnesses placing Thomas anywhere near Marcus that evening, and a plausible explanation for his polygraph responses, Sarah had to move on. Thomas remained a person of interest, noted in the case file as someone whose timeline couldn't be fully verified, but not enough existed to justify further scrutiny. Other interviews included Marcus's father Robert Chen, ruled out. He was in Seattle. Members of the search and rescue team, local business owners, even the delivery driver who'd seen the abandoned truck. Each interview was documented, each alibi verified. The pattern that emerged was frustrating. Marcus Chen had no enemies, no one with clear motive to harm him, no evidence of interpersonal conflict that might explain violence. By March 2010, Sarah had exhausted the obvious suspects. Either Marcus's disappearance was a tragic accident, he'd wandered into the wilderness and succumbed to elements, or someone had successfully concealed their involvement with extraordinary care. The interviews had generated volumes of testimony, but zero actionable leads. The Marcus Chen investigation was littered with leads that seemed promising but ultimately went nowhere, each false hope adding to the frustration that slowly consumed the case. A witness came forward in late January claiming to have seen a man matching Marcus's description at a rest stop near Butte, 90 miles from Copper Ridge, 2 days after his disappearance. Law enforcement responded immediately, reviewing surveillance footage from the location. The footage showed a man in similar clothing, but facial recognition analysis ruled out Marcus. The witness had been mistaken, eager to help but ultimately adding noise to an investigation desperate for signal. In February, a hiker discovered a blue parka partially buried in snow near Canyon Ferry Lake, 40 miles from where Marcus's truck was found. The parka matched Marcus's general style. Evidence technicians processed it carefully, finding a wallet in the inner pocket. The ID belonged to a transient who'd been reported missing from Great Falls the previous year, a different case, a different tragedy, no connection to Marcus Chen. Anonymous tips flooded the hotline. Someone claimed to have seen Marcus's truck parked behind a cabin near Lincoln. Deputies investigated, finding the cabin belonged to a seasonal worker whose black Dodge Ram was a different model year. Another caller insisted Marcus had been spotted in Spokane, Washington, working under an assumed name. FBI agents followed up, locating the man in question, who looked nothing like Marcus and had lived in Spokane for 5 years. Cell phone forensics offered brief hope. Analysts worked to extract additional data from tower records, looking for any signal after 7:03 p.m. They found anomalies, pings that might have been Marcus's phone attempting to connect in low-signal areas. Triangulation suggested possible locations deep in the wilderness. Search teams deployed to these coordinates, spending days combing areas identified by the technology. They found nothing. The pings had been artifacts, reflections, or signals from other devices misattributed in the database. A psychic contacted the sheriff's office in March, claiming visions of Marcus trapped in an abandoned mine shaft near MacDonald Pass. Despite skepticism, deputies checked every abandoned mine in the area. Mining history meant dozens of potential sites. Each shaft was explored, dogs sent in were safe, but Marcus wasn't in any of them. The psychic's visions led nowhere but wasted a week of investigative time. Financial analysis revealed a $500 cash withdrawal from Marcus's account 2 days before his disappearance. Investigators wondered if this suggested planning. Was he preparing to run? Further investigation showed Marcus had used the cash to pay his share of rent to Kevin, who confirmed receiving the money. Another dead end. A former colleague of Thomas Brennan mentioned in passing that Thomas had seemed off in the weeks before Marcus disappeared. Sarah re-interviewed this colleague extensively. The off behavior amounted to Thomas being quieter than usual, attributed to the anniversary of his wife's death. No evidence of planning, no suspicious actions, nothing that suggested involvement in Marcus's disappearance. By summer 2010, Sarah Hutchins's case file contained 127 documented leads. Of those, 119 had been investigated and conclusively eliminated. 8 remained open but unlikely. The psychological toll on the investigation team was mounting. Each false lead meant renewed hope for Marcus's family, followed by crushing disappointment. Each dead end meant starting over, questioning assumptions, wondering what they'd missed. The most haunting dead end was the simplest: Marcus's cell phone. It had pinged at 7:03 p.m. and then vanished. No more signals, no activity, no trace. In 2010. Without GPS tracking, without modern smartphone surveillance capabilities, that phone might as well have been erased from existence. Somewhere in Montana, in a ravine, a river, or buried in soil, Marcus Chen's phone held answers that technology couldn't yet extract. The case wasn't officially closed, but by late 2010, active investigation had effectively ceased. Sarah kept the file on her desk, reviewing it periodically, but new cases demanded attention. Marcus Chen joined the growing list of Montana's unsolved disappearances, his black Dodge Ram gathering dust in an evidence facility, his father waiting in Seattle for a phone call that would never come. Robert Chen stopped sleeping in 2010. He would tell people this matter-of-factly, as though it were simply a fact of his new existence. He couldn't sleep in the bed he'd shared with his wife before her death in 2007. Couldn't close his eyes without seeing Marcus's face. Instead, he sat in Marcus's childhood bedroom in the Seattle house for hours. He kept everything exactly as Marcus had left it during his last visit at Thanksgiving 2009. The wildlife posters still hung on the walls, the bookshelf still held field guides from high school, the desk still bore Marcus's old microscope from his first biology class. Robert couldn't bring himself to change anything. The room became a shrine, a frozen moment in time before January 8, 2010 changed everything. He flew to Montana every month for 5 years, walked the route from the research station to where Marcus's truck was found, talked to anyone who would listen, printed his own flyers when the official search posters faded from telephone poles, hired 2 private investigators with retirement savings he'd planned to use for travel. The investigators produced detailed reports but no answers. Every lead they pursued had already been exhausted by law enforcement. Robert learned the landscape of Lewis and Clark County by heart. He hiked trails Marcus had hiked, visited research sites Marcus had monitored, spoke to people Marcus had known. He attended every search operation, sometimes staying out long after volunteers had gone home, calling his son's name into the wilderness until his voice gave out. Other searchers learned to expect him to bring extra water because Robert would forget to bring his own, too focused on the impossible task of finding Marcus through sheer force of will. By 2013, his hair had gone completely gray. By 2015, he'd lost his job as a civil engineer, unable to focus on structural calculations when his mind was constantly mapping search grids and reviewing witness statements. His colleagues tried to be understanding, but eventually the firm had to let him go. Robert barely noticed. Money didn't matter, career didn't matter, only finding Marcus mattered. He kept a detailed journal of every search, every interview, every piece of information he gathered. The notebooks filled a closet in his Seattle home, 12 years of obsessive documentation, maps annotated with theories, timelines reconstructed from fragments of memory and official reports. Friends stopped calling, unable to bear watching Robert consume himself. His brother tried to convince him to see a therapist. Robert refused. Therapy won't bring Marcus back, searching will. His marriage to Marcus's mother had ended in 2008, strained by her illness and eventual death from cancer. Marcus had been Robert's anchor after that loss, the reason to continue. When Marcus disappeared, Robert lost the future he'd imagined, grandchildren he'd never meet, research papers with his son's name he'd never read, the pride of watching Marcus earn his PhD. All of it vanished on a frozen Montana highway. Every January 8th, Robert flew to Montana and spent the day retracing Marcus's last known route. He'd start at the research station, drive to the location where the truck was found, then walk into the wilderness along the path search teams had covered. He'd carry Marcus's photo, showing it to anyone he encountered, asking if they'd seen his son. Year after year, the answer was always no. Robert never stopped believing answers existed. He couldn't accept that Marcus had simply vanished, that a human being could disappear so completely in the modern age. Someone knows something, he'd say to anyone who'd listen. In a town like Copper Ridge, someone always knows. He was right. Someone did know. Someone had known for 12 years, had walked past Robert at search operations, had offered condolences while hiding the truth. But Robert wouldn't learn this until 2022, when a combination of technology and persistence finally cracked open the secret that had consumed his life. If you're finding this story as heartbreaking as I did while researching it, take a moment to leave a like. It helps more people discover these important stories. Marcus Chen's mother, Linda Chen, had died of ovarian cancer in December 2007, 2 years before her son's disappearance. In some ways, this was a mercy. She was spared the agony of searching for missing child, the endless hoping and waiting that consumed Robert. But in Marcus's final years, Linda had been his confidante, the parent who understood his passion for wildlife biology, who'd encouraged him to pursue graduate work in Montana despite the distance from Seattle. Marcus had spoken of his mother often to friends in Copper Ridge. She'd been a botanist, had instilled in him the love of ecology that became his career. After her death, Marcus had scattered some of her ashes in the Helena National Forest, near a meadow where wildflowers bloomed in summer. He told colleagues he felt her presence there, felt connected to her when he was doing field work. When Marcus disappeared, that meadow became another site of grief. Robert would visit it during his Montana trips, standing among the pine trees, wondering if his wife somehow knew their son was lost, if in whatever existence followed death she was searching for Marcus too. The absence of Linda meant Robert faced the nightmare alone. There was no partner to share the burden, no one who understood the depth of loss the way only a parent could. Friends and extended family offered support, but grief of this magnitude was isolating. Robert often thought about how Linda would have handled the search, her methodical scientist's mind, her ability to stay calm under pressure. He wondered if she would have been stronger than he was, or if the loss would have broken her too. Marcus had been their only child. Linda's cancer had made further pregnancies impossible. All their parental hopes, all their dreams of legacy had been invested in Marcus. His disappearance didn't just take their son, it erased their future as a family, ended their line, left Robert as the sole custodian of memories that would die with him. In his darkest moments, Robert was grateful Linda hadn't lived to see January 2010. The cancer had been agonizing, but at least it ended. This grief, the not knowing, the searching, the endless possibility without resolution, this was worse than death. This was suspended animation, unable to mourn fully because hope refused to die completely. Linda's absence shaped how the case was covered. Media stories mentioned his father, Robert Chen, but rarely noted the mother who'd already been lost. The community saw Robert's solitary grief, one man against the wilderness, and the image became iconic, the lone father who refused to give up. But Robert carried two losses. He'd buried his wife and said goodbye. He couldn't bury his son, couldn't say goodbye, couldn't close the circle of grief that Linda's death had at least completed. He existed in limbo, waiting for an ending that took 12 more years to arrive. Marcus Chen had no siblings. He'd been an only child, which made his disappearance even more devastating for Robert. There were no brothers or sisters to share the burden of searching. No extended family dynamics to complicate or support the investigation. The Chen family was simply Robert and Marcus, and when Marcus vanished, Robert became a family of one. This isolation intensified Robert's obsession. In families with multiple children, parents sometimes found purpose in caring for those who remained. Robert had no one. His entire parental identity had been bound to Marcus, and that identity was now in suspended animation, neither lost nor present, neither grieving nor hoping, stuck in the terrible limbo of not knowing. Marcus's closest relationships had been with friends who became like siblings. Kevin Ortega, his roommate, experienced grief similar to losing a brother. They'd shared an apartment for 3 years, had hiked hundreds of miles together, had planned to continue living together while Marcus pursued his PhD. Kevin attended every search operation, took unpaid leave from work to help look for Marcus, and struggled with survivor's guilt. Why had Marcus driven alone that night instead of waiting to carpool with Kevin as they sometimes did? At the research station, Andrea Walsh and other colleagues became Marcus's work family. They'd celebrated birthdays together, commiserated over failed grant applications, shared the mundane intimacies of daily professional life. Andrea kept Marcus's desk exactly as he'd left it for over a year, unable to pack up his field notes and personal items. When the station director finally required the space for a new hire, Andrea took Marcus's belongings home and stored them in her garage, unable to discard them but unwilling to give them to Robert. The act of handing over Marcus's possessions felt too much like admitting he was gone forever. The absence of siblings meant no nieces or nephews carrying Marcus's genetic legacy, no next generation to remember him. When Robert died, and he thought about this often, there would be no one left who shared Marcus's blood, no family continuing forward. The Chen line would end, Marcus's DNA preserved only in evidence storage in Helena, in case files that would eventually be archived and forgotten. This finality haunted Robert. In cultures where family continuation matters deeply, he felt he'd failed. His son had disappeared before having children, before passing on the Chen name, before creating the family Robert and Linda had hoped to see. The disappearance wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was the erasure of a family line, the end of a story that should have continued for generations. Copper Ridge, Montana, was never quite the same after January 2010. The disappearance of Marcus Chen fractured the trust that small mountain communities require to survive harsh winters and geographic isolation. Before Marcus vanished, people left doors unlocked, children played unsupervised in the woods, hitchhiking was common along Highway 12. After everything changed, parents became hyper-vigilant. Children who'd once roamed freely were now driven to activities, tracked constantly, forbidden from wandering the forest trails that had been their playground. The unspoken understanding that the wilderness was dangerous but the community was safe had been inverted. Now the wilderness was just wilderness, but the community itself felt threatening. Local businesses suffered. Tourism, already minimal in winter, dropped further. The research station struggled to recruit new biologists who wanted to work in a place where a colleague had vanished without trace. 2 researchers transferred to other locations within 6 months of Marcus's disappearance. Dr. Patricia Morrison fought to keep the station operational, but funding became precarious as the association with tragedy overshadowed scientific work. Social dynamics shifted. The annual community potlucks became strained affairs, people showing up out of obligation rather than genuine fellowship. Conversations that used to flow naturally now hit awkward pauses when anyone mentioned winter driving, Highway 12, or search efforts. Some families stopped attending altogether, unable to bear the weight of collective unresolved grief. The volunteer search and rescue team, which Marcus had been part of, faced internal tensions. Some members burned out from the extended search operations and quit. Others became more committed but also more somber. The fun camaraderie replaced by grim determination. They'd failed to find one of their own, and that failure haunted every subsequent rescue operation. Trust eroded in subtle ways. When Thomas Brennan continued working at the research station, some colleagues treated him differently. Nothing overt, no accusations, but a slight distance in interactions, a hesitancy in conversations. He'd been questioned by police. His polygraph was inconclusive for some people. That was enough to create permanent doubt, even without evidence. The Copper Ridge Diner, once a social hub, became quieter. Regulars still came for coffee, but the easy gossip and laughter diminished. The case hung over every conversation. Waitresses learned not to ask, "How are you doing?" because the honest answer was too dark for casual interaction. By 2015, Copper Ridge's population had dropped to 651, 38 fewer residents than in 2010. Some families moved away, unable to bear living in a town marked by unsolved tragedy. Younger people left for college or jobs elsewhere and didn't return. The aging demographics worried the town council, but how do you attract new residents to a place defined by disappearance? A memorial bench was placed near the research station in 2011, a small brass plaque reading in memory of Marcus Chen, who loved these mountains. It became a place for quiet reflection, but also a constant reminder of loss. Some people avoided walking past it, others left flowers occasionally, especially on January 8th anniversaries. The case changed Copper Ridge's relationship with law enforcement too. Some residents felt police hadn't searched hard enough, had given up too quickly. Others understood the limitations but still felt abandoned when active investigation ceased. Sheriff Martinez retired in 2018, and some said the Chen case had aged him beyond his years. Copper Ridge remained a functioning town. People still worked, raised families, celebrated holidays. But beneath the surface, the community was marked. They'd lost one of their own and didn't know how or why. That uncertainty, that lack of closure, became part of Copper Ridge's identity. Before, they were a small Montana mountain town. After January 2010, they were the town where Marcus Chen disappeared. The first year was active searching. The second year was persistent hoping. By the third year, reality was settling in. Marcus Chen might never be found. 2010 became 2011, and the case file moved from Sarah Hutchins's active desk to a cabinet reserved for cold cases. She still reviewed it quarterly, still ran new leads when they emerged, but the daily urgency had faded. New crimes demanded attention: assaults, robberies, other missing persons. Resources were finite. Time moved forward even when answers didn't. 2012 brought minor developments. A hunter found remains in the wilderness 30 miles from Copper Ridge. DNA analysis took 3 months. The bones belonged to a hiker who disappeared in 1997, another family finally getting closure, but not the Chens. That year, Robert Chen spent Marcus's 36th birthday in Montana, hiking trails alone, imagining what his son would be doing if he were alive. 2013 marked 3 years missing. Media coverage emerged around the anniversary, local news stories asking whatever happened to Marcus Chen. Sarah Hutchins gave interviews, careful not to say the case was unsolvable but unable to claim progress. The sheriff's office renewed appeals for information. Tips came in, were investigated, led nowhere. Robert returned to Seattle exhausted, beginning to understand that hope could be its own form of torture. 2014 saw advances in DNA technology that made Sarah wonder. Next-generation sequencing could extract genetic information from increasingly degraded samples. She submitted old evidence for retesting: fibers from Marcus's truck, samples from the vehicle interior. Results came back weeks later: no DNA except Marcus's and known associates, no unknown contributor. No breakthrough. 2015 brought tragedy of a different kind. Dr. Patricia Morrison died in a car accident on Highway 12, the same road where Marcus disappeared. The research station held a memorial, and Robert Chen flew out for the service. He stood among people who'd known Marcus, who'd searched for him, feeling the accumulated weight of loss. Morrison had been in her 50s, too young like Marcus. The wilderness kept taking. 2016 passed quietly. Then 2017, Robert turned 70. Retired fully now, spending half the year in Seattle and half in Montana. He'd rented a small apartment in Helena, couldn't stay away for long. Kevin Ortega had moved to Colorado, married, started a family. He named his first son Marcus, a tribute to his missing friend. Robert attended the baptism, held the baby, and cried. 2018 marked 8 years, almost a decade of not knowing. The research station had new staff who'd never met Marcus Chen. Andrea Walsh had transferred to Wyoming. Thomas Brennan still worked there, grayer, quieter, the weight of years visible in his posture. He still volunteered for search and rescue, still went into the wilderness looking for the lost. 2019 brought the 10-year anniversary. The Montana Standard ran a feature article, A Decade of Silence, the Marcus Chen Mystery. Sarah Hutchins, now promoted to senior investigator, told the reporter, "We haven't given up. Cold cases can break open years later. Technology keeps improving." She believed it when she said it, but privately wondered if belief was enough. 2020 came with its own catastrophe, COVID-19. The world shut down. Robert, now 74, isolated in Seattle, unable to make his January pilgrimage to Montana. He watched news of mounting deaths and thought about how Marcus's disappearance had prepared him for living with uncertainty, for accepting that sometimes there are no answers. 2021 arrived, and with it finally a development. Sarah Hutchins, reviewing cold cases during pandemic slowdown, noticed something in the evidence log. Marcus Chen's personal effects from his truck had been stored carefully: his backpack, his field notebook, his cell phone. The phone had been examined in 2010 but yielded little. Modern technology, though, might extract more. She submitted a request for re-examination using 2021 forensic capabilities. The phone, an iPhone 3G, obsolete but preserved, went to the state crime lab. Analysts used tools that hadn't existed in 2010 to extract data from corroded circuits and damaged memory. 3 months later, results arrived. The phone contained GPS data, fragmented but recoverable. Location records showed Marcus's route the night he disappeared, including a stop not previously documented. A stop at coordinates 2.3 miles from where his truck was found, deep in the forest off an unmarked access road. The phone had been there for approximately 18 minutes before losing power. Sarah Hutchins looked at the coordinates, cross-referenced them with topographic maps, felt her pulse quicken. After 11 years of dead ends, the case was about to break wide open. Every January 8th for 12 years, Robert Chen performed the same ritual. He woke before dawn in his Helena apartment, dressed in layers against Montana cold, and drove to Copper Ridge. He'd park at the Montana Wildlife Research Station, stand in the lot where Marcus had last been seen alive, and speak to his son. "Marcus, it's Dad, it's been another year, I'm still here, I'm still looking." Then he'd drive Highway 2, stopping at the exact location where Marcus's truck had been found. The coordinates were burned into his memory: 46, 8,742 degrees N, 112, 1,156 degrees W. He'd stand on the shoulder, watching traffic pass, imagining that night, the ice storm, the darkness, his son pulling over for some unknown reason. Robert brought the same items every year: a thermos of coffee, Marcus's favorite brand, a printed photo of them together from Thanksgiving 2009, and a handwritten letter updating Marcus on the past year. The letters were never mailed, never read by anyone but Robert himself, but writing them felt necessary. He'd read the letter aloud at the truck location, his voice carrying into the forest. "Dear Marcus, I turned 75 this year. My knees aren't what they used to be, but I can still hike. I've been walking the trails you studied, watching the wolves you tracked. Your research station published a paper citing your early data. Your work still matters, son." After reading the letter, Robert would fold it carefully and add it to a growing collection stored in a fireproof box in his Seattle home. 12 letters, 12 years of one-sided conversation with a son who couldn't answer. The ritual concluded with a hike. Robert would walk into the wilderness from the truck location, following paths search teams had covered years before, calling Marcus's name. He knew his son wasn't lost in the forest, disoriented and waiting for rescue. If Marcus were alive and conscious, he would have found his way out years ago. But Robert called anyway, the ritual more important than logic. Other rituals emerged among those who'd known Marcus. At the research station, staff held a moment of silence every January 8th at 6:47 p.m., the time Marcus had walked out the door for the last time. Andrea Walsh, even after transferring to Wyoming, took the day off work and spent it hiking, honoring Marcus's love of wilderness. Kevin Ortega in Colorado lit a candle every anniversary, explaining to his children about Uncle Marcus, the friend who disappeared before they were born. He'd show them photos, tell stories about research trips and mountain adventures, keeping Marcus's memory alive in the next generation. In Copper Ridge, the memorial bench near the research station became a gathering point. People who'd participated in searches would meet there informally on January 8th, not as organized commemoration but as natural convergence. They'd share coffee, remember the days spent looking, wonder aloud if answers would ever come. Sarah Hutchins had her own ritual. She'd pull the Marcus Chen case file, read through it completely, looking for something missed. In 12 years, she'd read the file 12 times from beginning to end. Every detail was memorized, every interview transcript familiar, every dead end explored exhaustively. Still she read because that's what you did when you'd promised a family you wouldn't give up. The rituals served different purposes for different people. For Robert, they maintained connection with his son, refused to accept disappearance as ending. For colleagues and friends, they honored memory and processed grief. For investigators, they represented commitment to justice even when justice seemed impossible. On January 8, 2022, the 12th anniversary, Robert Chen performed his ritual not knowing it would be the last time. He stood at the coordinates, read his letter, walked into the forest. But this time, change was already in motion. In Helena, Sarah Hutchins was coordinating with the state crime lab about GPS data recovered from Marcus's phone. The coordinates from that data pointed to a location Robert had walked past dozens of times over the years, never knowing his son was there, buried under Montana soil waiting to be found. By 2022, Copper Ridge had transformed from a community defined by disappearance to one learning to exist alongside permanent uncertainty. The sharp pain of January 2010 had dulled into chronic ache, still present, still affecting daily life, but no longer dominating every conversation and thought. The memorial bench remained, now weathered by 12 Montana winters, the brass plaque tarnished but still legible. It had become part of the landscape, noticed by newcomers who asked about it, taken for granted by longtime residents who passed it daily. Fresh flowers appeared less frequently, only on major anniversaries now, rather than the weekly tributes that marked the first years. The research station had turned over almost completely. Of the staff who'd worked with Marcus, only Thomas Brennan remained. He'd become the institutional memory, the person new hires asked about, that biologist who disappeared. Thomas would tell the story briefly, factually, leaving out his own polygraph complications and the lingering suspicions some had held. Marcus Chen was dedicated to his work, he'd say. He disappeared in 2010, we never found out what happened. The town's relationship with Highway 12 had evolved. It was still the main artery connecting Copper Ridge to Helena, still traveled daily by residents. But certain sections carried weight. The stretch where Marcus's truck was found became a place people sped through, unconsciously avoiding prolonged presence. Some drivers crossed themselves passing that spot, a secular prayer for the lost. Copper Ridge's population had stabilized around 640, the exodus of the early 2010s having ceased. New families had moved in, attracted by remote work opportunities and mountain lifestyle. These newcomers knew the Marcus Chen story only as local history, the way they knew about the 1974 mine collapse or the 1988 forest fire, tragic, important, but not personally felt. The social fabric had been rewoven, though the pattern was different. The deep trust of the pre-2010 era hadn't fully returned. People were more careful, more aware that terrible things could happen even in small communities. Parents tracked their teenagers more closely. Hitchhiking never resumed its former casual acceptance. The unquestioned safety of Copper Ridge had been revealed as illusion, yet life continued. Children were born, graduated high school, left for college. Businesses operated. Morrison's General Store changed ownership but kept the name. The Copper Ridge Diner installed new booths. The First Presbyterian Church held services every Sunday, the congregation aging but persistent. The community maintained itself through the basic machinery of small-town existence. The annual Copper Ridge Winter Festival, suspended in 2011 due to the pall of Marcus's disappearance, had resumed by 2015. It was more subdued than before, less celebratory, more reflective, but it happened. Communities needed their rituals, needed markers of time and season, needed reasons to gather that weren't tragedy. By 2022, teenagers had grown up knowing Copper Ridge only in its post-Marcus form. To them, the disappearance was history, not lived experience. They knew the story, everyone in town did, but it didn't shape their daily lives the way it shaped their parents. This generational distance was healthy in some ways, painful in others. Memory was fading. Marcus Chen was becoming legend rather than person. For those who'd known him, this fading was bittersweet. The acute grief had subsided, replaced by occasional melancholy. They could speak his name without breaking down, could remember good times without spiraling into despair over his absence. Healing, incomplete and imperfect, had occurred. What no one in Copper Ridge knew in early 2022 was that their community was about to be transformed again, not by continued absence, but by discovery. The coordinates recovered from Marcus's phone would lead investigators to a grave hidden for 12 years. The case would break open spectacularly. And Copper Ridge would learn that sometimes the greatest transformation comes not from loss itself, but from finally understanding what was lost and who took it and why. The community that had learned to live with mystery was about to confront truth, and truth, as they would discover, could be even harder to bear than uncertainty. The breakthrough came on March 15, 2022, in a forensic laboratory in Helena, Montana. Sarah Hutchins received the call at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon that would change everything. "We've got location data," the crime lab technician told her. "GPS coordinates from Chen's iPhone, fragmentary but recoverable." Sarah had submitted Marcus Chen's phone for re-examination 2 months earlier, hoping that 12 years of technological advancement might extract information impossible to retrieve in 2010. The iPhone 3G had been obsolete for years, but its solid-state memory, though degraded, still held data. Modern forensic tools could read corrupted sectors, reconstruct deleted files, pull location histories from damaged chips. The technician walked Sarah through the findings. Marcus's phone had recorded GPS waypoints that night, not continuously as modern phones do, but periodic location stamps triggered by certain actions. The data showed his route from the research station, matched the highway surveillance footage, confirmed the 7:03 p.m. cell tower ping. But then something new. At 7:38 p.m. the phone recorded coordinates 3 miles from where Marcus's truck was ultimately found. The location was off Highway 12 down an unmarked Forest Service access road that barely appeared on maps. The phone remained at those coordinates for approximately 18 minutes. At 7:56 p.m. the final GPS stamp recorded movement back toward the highway. Then the phone died, battery exhausted or powered off, the data couldn't determine which. Sarah stared at the coordinates: 46, 8,891 degrees N, 112. 1,423 degrees W. She pulled up topographic maps, satellite imagery, Forest Service records. The location was dense woodland. No structures, no obvious reason for Marcus to have been there. But he had been there, his phone proved it, during the window when he disappeared. She assembled a team immediately. Sheriff Martinez, now retired but called back for this, joined her. FBI Special Agent Michael Torres, who'd worked the original case, flew in from Billings. A forensic recovery team from the state crime lab prepared equipment: ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, excavation tools. They prepared for what everyone now suspected, but no one wanted to say aloud. On March 17, 2 days after the GPS data was confirmed, the team converged on the coordinates. The access road was overgrown, barely passable even with four-wheel drive vehicles. They parked a quarter-mile away and hiked in, the forest silent except for wind through pine trees and the crunch of their boots on old snow. The GPS coordinates led them to a small clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines. It looked like 1,000 other patches of Montana wilderness, unremarkable, undisturbed, innocent. But the cadaver dogs reacted immediately, trained noses detecting what human senses couldn't. They circled a specific area approximately 15 feet from the clearing center and sat, the alert signal for human remains. Sarah Hutchins marked the perimeter with stakes and crime scene tape, though the nearest person was miles away. The excavation began slowly, carefully. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed an anomaly beneath the surface, something that didn't match natural soil composition, something that suggested deliberate burial. They worked through the afternoon, removing soil layer by layer, documenting depth and position. At 18 inches down, a technician's brush revealed fabric, dark blue synthetic material consistent with outdoor clothing. Sarah's breath caught. After 12 years of searching hundreds of square miles, they'd found Marcus Chen in less than 6 hours. The excavation continued into the next day. The body, remarkably preserved by cold Montana soil and depth of burial, was carefully exposed. Marcus Chen, still wearing the dark blue parka Andrea Walsh had seen him leave in, his backpack still strapped to his shoulders, his research notebook still in the pack's outer pocket. Sarah stood at the edge of the excavation site as the medical examiner photographed the remains in situ. 12 years she'd carried this case. 12 years Robert Chen had searched. 12 years Copper Ridge had lived with mystery. And now, in a clearing that search teams had probably walked past dozens of times, the answers were finally emerging from Montana soil. But discovery was only the beginning. The next question was simpler and infinitely more complicated. How did Marcus Chen end up buried here, and who put him in the ground? The excavation of Marcus Chen's remains took 3 days to complete properly. The forensic team worked with painstaking care, treating the burial site as both grave and crime scene. Every handful of soil was sifted, every item catalogued, every layer photographed before removal. The body's position told a story. Marcus was on his back, arms at his sides, legs straight, arranged, not discarded. This wasn't someone dumped hastily. This was careful burial, someone taking time to lay the body out properly, to dig deep enough that animals wouldn't disturb it, to cover it thoroughly enough that surface indicators wouldn't show. Personal effects recovered painted a picture of Marcus's final moments. His iPhone 3G, found in his jacket pocket, was sent for additional analysis. The screen was cracked, whether from impact or burial pressure, forensic analysts couldn't determine. His wallet contained $67, his driver's license, credit cards, all accounted for. Robbery wasn't the motive. His backpack held research equipment, GPS unit, radio telemetry receiver, field notebook with entries dated up to January 8, 2010. The final entry, written in Marcus's precise handwriting. Read: Wolfpack Echo moving southeast, tracks confirm 3 juveniles with group. Weather deteriorating, will continue monitoring from vehicle if conditions worsen. Most critically, the forensic team found trace evidence on Marcus's clothing that would prove essential. Caught in the fabric of his parka were several fibers, red and black checked pattern, consistent with flannel. The fibers were foreign to Marcus's known clothing, suggesting contact with someone else shortly before or after death. The medical examiner conducted preliminary assessment at the scene before authorizing transport. Cause of death wasn't immediately apparent: no obvious gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no skull fractures visible without detailed examination. The body's preservation allowed for thorough autopsy, but initial observations suggested Marcus might have died from blunt force trauma or asphyxiation, causes that would require laboratory confirmation. Soil samples from around and beneath the body were collected in sterile containers. These would be tested for blood trace, decomposition markers, and any chemicals that might indicate cause of death. The soil's composition and compaction would help determine how long the body had been buried. Likely confirmation of the 12-year timeline, but forensic verification was essential. The excavation team also documented the burial itself. The grave was approximately 4 feet deep, dug into soil that would have been frozen solid in January 2010. Someone had expended significant effort, hours of digging in frozen ground, in darkness or near darkness. In winter conditions, this wasn't impulsive. This was determined concealment. Tool marks on the grave walls suggested a standard shovel, nothing distinctive. But the effort required meant the person responsible was physically capable, had access to tools, and had time to work undisturbed. The location's remoteness was itself evidence. Whoever buried Marcus knew this area well enough to find it in winter conditions, knew it was rarely visited, knew it would keep it secret. On March 19, 2022, Marcus Chen's remains were transported to the Montana State Crime Lab in Missoula for complete forensic examination. The evidence bags containing fibers, soil samples, personal effects, and preserved tissue samples traveled in a secure vehicle, chain of custody documented at every transfer. Sarah Hutchins rode with the transport, unable to let the evidence out of her sight. 12 years of failure had made her paranoid about mistakes, about lost opportunities, about anything that might prevent this case from finally reaching resolution. She'd promised Robert Chen she wouldn't give up. Now she had to promise him she'd get it right. This breakthrough came after decades of silence. Hit the like button if you believe in the power of persistence and modern forensic science to bring justice. The autopsy of Marcus Chen was conducted on March 21, 2022 by Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, Montana's chief medical examiner. Sarah Hutchins attended as law enforcement observer, needing to understand every detail of how Marcus had died. The body's preservation was remarkable. Cold Montana soil, depth of burial, and the sealed environment of the grave had slowed decomposition significantly. Soft tissue remained, allowing for detailed examination that would have been impossible if Marcus had been exposed to elements for 12 years. Dr. Reeves worked methodically, documenting external injuries first. She found evidence of blunt force trauma to the back of Marcus's skull, a depressed fracture consistent with impact against a hard surface or being struck with a heavy object. The injury wouldn't have been immediately fatal, but would have caused severe concussion, disorientation, possibly loss of consciousness. More telling were injuries to Marcus's throat, bruising in the soft tissue, fracture of the hyoid bone, signs of strangulation or compression. Dr. Reeves reconstructed the sequence. Marcus suffered head trauma first, then died from asphyxiation, likely manual strangulation. Time between injuries suggested he'd been stunned by the head wound, then killed deliberately while incapacitated. This wasn't an accident, Dr. Reeves told Sarah. The head injury might have been a fall, a collision, but the strangulation was intentional. Someone made a choice to kill him. Toxicology screens came back negative. No drugs, no alcohol, no poisons. Marcus had been sober and healthy when he died. Stomach contents showed partially digested coffee and a protein bar consistent with his purchase at Morrison's General Store at 6:15 p.m., suggesting death occurred within hours of eating. The forensic team turned to the trace evidence. The flannel fibers found on Marcus's parka were analyzed using microscopy and chemical composition testing. They were identified as cotton blend, red and black checked pattern common in outdoor work shirts. The fibers showed weathering consistent with regular outdoor use. Here's where modern technology proved crucial. In 2010, fiber evidence could be classified and described, but DNA extraction from textile fibers was unreliable. By 2022, advanced techniques allowed for touch DNA recovery, skin cells shed onto fabric invisible but analyzable. The lab extracted DNA from epithelial cells found on the flannel fibers. The genetic profile was run through CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. No match initially. Whoever these cells belonged to wasn't in the criminal database. But Montana maintained its own database of DNA from various sources, including elimination samples from the original investigation. On March 28, 2022, the DNA lab called Sarah with results that made her hands shake. The DNA from the flannel fibers matched an elimination sample provided during the 2010 investigation. A sample from someone who'd volunteered to help rule themselves out. Someone who'd worked closely with the case, someone who'd been questioned and cleared based on inconclusive polygraph results and lack of physical evidence. The DNA belonged to Thomas R. Brennan, Marcus Chen's colleague at the Montana Wildlife Research Station, the man who'd mentored Marcus, the man who'd helped search for him, the man who'd lived 12 years with the secret of where Marcus was buried. Sarah read the report 3 times, checking the case numbers, verifying the chain of custody, making absolutely certain before acting. Then she picked up her phone and called Sheriff Martinez. "We've got him," she said. "We know who killed Marcus Chen." The moment came in Sarah Hutchins's office in Helena, Montana on a Wednesday afternoon in March 2022. She sat surrounded by 12 years of case files, DNA reports spread across her desk, and the inescapable conclusion that someone she'd interviewed in 2010 had been lying the entire time. Thomas R. Brennan, age 54 in 2022, 42 when Marcus disappeared. Wildlife biologist, Vietnam veteran son, widower living alone in Copper Ridge. A man who'd seemed genuinely devastated by his colleague's disappearance, who'd searched longer and harder than almost anyone except Robert Chen himself. Sarah pulled the original interview transcripts. Thomas's initial statement from January 12, 2010. "I left the station around 5:00 p.m. on January 8th. Marcus was still working. I went home, spent the evening reading. I wish I'd offered to drive him. The weather was getting bad." His polygraph results inconclusive with elevated stress responses when asked about knowing what happened to Marcus. At the time, Sarah had attributed this to guilt about not helping Marcus, to genuine distress over his disappearance. Now she understood the stress came from actively concealing murder. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Thomas's DNA on fibers found on Marcus's body. Those fibers came from flannel work shirts Thomas wore regularly. Sarah found photos from the search operations showing him in exactly that style of shirt, red and black checked pattern. He'd been wearing the evidence of his crime while pretending to look for his victim. Sarah reconstructed what must have happened. Marcus left the research station at 6:47 p.m. Thomas, who claimed to have left at 5:00 p.m., must have stayed nearby or returned. He intercepted Marcus somehow, called him, flagged him down, suggested meeting at the remote Forest Service road for some plausible reason. Marcus trusted Thomas completely, would have followed him anywhere. At the isolated location, something happened, an argument, a confrontation. The head injury suggested Marcus was struck or fell. Then Thomas made the choice, rather than call for help, rather than report an accident, he strangled Marcus to death. Spent hours digging a grave in frozen ground, buried his colleague and returned to his life, carrying the secret. The motive remained unclear, professional jealousy, a personal dispute. Something that happened that night that Thomas couldn't let Marcus reveal. Sarah would find out during interrogation, but the physical evidence was already sufficient for arrest. She coordinated with the Lewis and Clark County Attorney's Office. The prosecutor David Chen, no relation to Marcus, the shared surname was cruel coincidence, reviewed the evidence and authorized charges, second-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence. On March 30, 2022, arrest warrants were issued for Thomas R. Brennan. Sarah assembled the arrest team: Sheriff Martinez, 2 state troopers, FBI agent Torres who'd worked the original case. They'd take Thomas at his home in Copper Ridge early morning when he'd be alone, minimizing chances of confrontation. Sarah spent the evening before the arrest reviewing everything one final time. She thought about Robert Chen, who'd searched for 12 years. She thought about the Copper Ridge community, fractured by suspicion and mystery. She thought about Marcus, buried alone in the wilderness while the man who killed him pretended to mourn. She picked up her phone and made the call she'd waited 12 years to make. "Mr. Chen, this is Investigator Sarah Hutchins. Sir, we found Marcus, and we know what happened to him." The silence on the other end of the line lasted 5 seconds that felt like hours. Then Robert Chen's voice. Barely a whisper, "Tell me." Sarah told him: the GPS data, the burial site, the forensic evidence, the DNA match to Thomas Brennan. Robert listened without interrupting, processing information that would reshape everything he'd believed about his son's disappearance. When Sarah finished, Robert asked the question she'd expected. "Why? I don't know yet," Sarah admitted, "but I'm going to find out. We're arresting him tomorrow morning." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her dark office, feeling the weight of closure approaching. 12 years of her career had been shadowed by this case. Tomorrow it would finally break open. Justice was coming, delayed but not denied. She thought Thomas Brennan would confess. The evidence was overwhelming, and carrying that secret for 12 years had to have taken its toll. She was right. But what Thomas would reveal during interrogation would prove that sometimes the truth is more tragic than anyone imagined. Thomas Russell Brennan was born in 1968 in Billings, Montana, the oldest son of a Vietnam veteran and an elementary school teacher. He earned his biology degree from Montana State University in 1990, worked for the Forest Service for 8 years, then joined the Montana Wildlife Research Station in 2002. His personnel file painted a picture of competence and dedication. 12 published research papers on elk population dynamics, 8 years of exemplary performance reviews, a reputation as a patient mentor who trained younger biologists in field techniques. When Marcus Chen applied for position in 2005, Thomas had been his strongest advocate, recognizing in Marcus the same passion for conservation biology that had driven Thomas's own career. Colleagues described Thomas as quiet, methodical, sometimes socially awkward but deeply committed to his work. His wife, Catherine, died in 2007 from an aneurysm, sudden, devastating, leaving Thomas alone in the small house they'd shared in Copper Ridge. He'd never remarried, never dated afterward that anyone knew of, just worked and came home to an empty house. After Marcus disappeared, Thomas's life continued in its quiet rhythms. He still went to work at the research station, still conducted field studies, still published occasionally. He volunteered for search and rescue, participated in community events, attended the First Presbyterian Church irregularly. Nothing in his behavior suggested he was carrying the secret of murder, but there were signs if anyone had known to look. Thomas developed insomnia after 2010, colleagues noticed. He'd mentioned casually that he didn't sleep well, attributed it to aging. He drank more, not to excess. Not enough to cause concern, but more than before. Stopped socializing even the limited amount he had previously. Became more withdrawn, more isolated. His home, when the search warrant was executed, revealed the life of someone not quite living. Minimal furniture, few personal items, photographs of his late wife, but nothing more recent. His computer history showed obsessive checking of news about the Marcus Chen case, reading every update, every anniversary story. In his bedroom closet, investigators found a box containing items from the search operations, maps marked with grid patterns, volunteer coordination sheets, a journal where Thomas had documented his own search efforts. The journal was particularly haunting. Entry after entry about looking for Marcus, about covering ground systematically, about hope fading. On the surface, it read like a concerned colleague's dedication. Knowing what investigators now knew, it read like compulsive returning to the scene, unable to stay away from the secret he'd buried. Financial records showed Thomas living modestly on his researcher salary, no unusual expenditures, no signs of the kind of behavioral changes that often follow violent crime. He'd filed taxes normally, maintained his home, kept his job, existed in perfect ordinary normalcy while concealing murder. The most damning revelation came from his work files. Investigators examining Thomas's research computer found a folder labeled Field Notes January 2010. Inside were observations from the night Marcus disappeared, notes about weather conditions, about search coordination, about witness statements, and buried in the metadata, file creation dates showing Thomas had begun documenting the search operation on January 9, 2010. Before Marcus was reported missing, he'd known Marcus was gone before anyone else did. He'd started preparing his cover story, his explanation for being unable to find his colleague before the official search even began. The premeditation was clear. Background investigation revealed no criminal history, no violence in Thomas's past, no warning signs that he was capable of murder. Interviews with people who'd known him for years produced universal shock. "Thomas Brennan, no way, he's the gentlest person I know," one colleague insisted. "He cried when we had to euthanize an injured deer." But forensic psychology consultation suggested a profile, someone conflict avoidant who could snap under specific stressors, someone whose public persona of quiet competence masked deeper instability, someone capable of rationalizing violence as necessary while maintaining surface normalcy. The 12 years of successful concealment suggested high intelligence and emotional compartmentalization. As investigators dug deeper, they found one more critical detail. In Thomas's home office, in a locked drawer of his desk, was a letter, handwritten, undated, never sent, addressed to Robert Chen. Sarah Hutchins read it with growing understanding of what had driven Thomas to kill Mr. Chen, I need you to know it was an accident. Marcus confronted me about errors in my research, errors that would have cost me my job, my reputation, everything I'd worked for. We argued. I didn't mean to hurt him, but when he fell and hit his head, I panicked. I couldn't let anyone know. I'm sorry. I've been sorry every day for 12 years, but I couldn't tell the truth. I couldn't lose everything. The letter was never sent, perhaps never intended to be sent, but it was confession, motive, and explanation all in one. Thomas Brennan had killed Marcus Chen to protect his career, then spent 12 years living with the choice he'd made in a moment of panic on a frozen Montana night. March 31, 2022 began as an ordinary Thursday in Copper Ridge. Thomas Brennan's alarm woke him at 5:30 a.m. as it had for years. He showered, dressed in work clothes, made coffee in the empty kitchen of his small house. He had no idea that 3 miles away, a law enforcement team was finalizing plans to take him into custody. Sarah Hutchins, Sheriff Martinez, FBI Agent Torres, and 4 state troopers converged on Copper Ridge at 6:00 a.m. They parked 2 blocks from Thomas's house, coordinating by radio. The plan was straightforward: knock on the door, announce themselves, execute the warrant. They anticipated cooperation. Thomas had no history of violence beyond the murder itself, owned no firearms according to registration databases, had shown no flight risk in 12 years. At 6:17 a.m., the team approached Thomas's house. Lights were on inside. He was awake, likely preparing for work. Sarah knocked firmly. "Thomas Brennan, this is Montana Department of Justice. We need you to open the door." 15 seconds of silence, then the porch light came on. Door opened. Thomas stood in the doorway, still holding his coffee mug, and Sarah saw recognition in his eyes, not surprise, but resignation. He'd known this day would come eventually. "Thomas Brennan, you're under arrest for the murder of Marcus Chen," Sarah said, reading from the warrant. "You have the right to remain silent." Thomas didn't resist, didn't run, didn't protest innocence. He set down his coffee mug carefully on the hallway table, held out his hands for the handcuffs, and said quietly, "I'd like to call my attorney." The arrest was professional, calm, anticlimactic after 12 years of investigation. Thomas was placed in the patrol vehicle, transported to the Lewis and Clark County Detention Center in Helena, processed through booking. At 7:45 a.m., his first appearance before a judge was scheduled. News traveled fast in Copper Ridge. By 8:00 a.m., the Montana Wildlife Research Station knew their colleague had been arrested. By 9:00 a.m., media had picked up the story. Arrest made in 12-year-old Marcus Chen cold case. By noon, the country knew. Robert Chen learned through Sarah's phone call placed before the arrest to prevent him from hearing through media. "Mr. Chen, we're taking Thomas Brennan into custody this morning. I wanted you to know before it becomes public." Robert sat in his Seattle apartment, processing information his brain struggled to accept. Thomas Brennan, the man who'd searched with him, the man who'd expressed sympathy, who'd seemed to understand Robert's determination to find his son. That man had killed Marcus, had buried him, had lied for 12 years while Robert searched. The betrayal was almost worse than the murder itself. At Thomas's first appearance, held at 2:00 p.m. on March 31st, he stood before Judge Patricia O'Neill wearing orange jail scrubs, hands shackled. His court-appointed attorney, Daniel Morrison, stood beside him. The prosecutor David Chen read charges, second-degree murder, tampering with physical evidence. Judge O'Neill asked for plea. Thomas's voice was barely audible, not guilty. Bail hearing followed immediately. The prosecutor argued for no bail. 12 years of concealment demonstrated flight risk and danger to community. The defense argued Thomas had remained in Copper Ridge throughout, had no criminal history, posed no flight risk. Judge O'Neill ruled bail denied. The nature of these charges, the extended concealment, and the deliberate participation in search efforts while knowing the victim's location demonstrate a level of deception that precludes release pending trial. Thomas was remanded to custody. As he was led from the courtroom, he glanced once toward the gallery where Robert Chen sat in the front row. Their eyes met for 3 seconds. Robert saw something in Thomas's face, not defiance, not fear, but exhaustion. The weight of 12 years of secrecy ending not in relief but in reckoning. In Copper Ridge, the community reacted with shock and horror. The man they'd trusted, who'd lived among them, who'd pretended to search for Marcus while knowing exactly where the body was, it shattered what little faith remained after 12 years of suspicion and mystery. The Copper Ridge Diner became ground zero for processing collective trauma. People gathered, needing to be together, needing to talk through the impossible. "I searched with Thomas," one volunteer said, voice shaking. "We walked right past where Marcus was buried. Thomas knew, he knew the whole time." The research station closed for the day, staff too shaken to work. Dr. Morrison's successor held an emergency meeting, offering counseling resources, trying to help people understand how their trusted colleague could have hidden such a terrible secret. Sarah Hutchins returned to her office after the hearing, feeling the complicated mix of satisfaction and sadness that comes with solving a case through such tragic revelation. Justice was in motion. But it couldn't undo 12 years of Robert Chen's searching, couldn't restore Marcus's life, couldn't heal Copper Ridge's fractured trust. She opened her case file one more time, preparing for what came next. Interrogation, prosecution, trial. Thomas Brennan would have the opportunity to explain himself, to provide the answers that the physical evidence couldn't. And Sarah intended to make sure every question was asked, every truth extracted before this case was finally completely closed. The arrest of Thomas Brennan hit Copper Ridge like a second tragedy, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. On March 31, 2022, the town of 640 people learned that one of their own, someone they'd known for 20 years, someone they'd trusted, someone they'd grieved alongside, was a murderer who'd hidden among them for over a decade. The Copper Ridge Diner became crisis central. By mid-morning, the small restaurant was packed with people who needed to be together, needed to process, needed to understand. Conversations ran in circles of disbelief. "Thomas searched with us for weeks. He walked right past where he'd buried Marcus. How could someone do that? How could someone lie like that?" Martha Williams, who owned the diner, provided free coffee and let people sit for hours. "Nobody knows what to say," she told a reporter. "We're all just shattered. We thought we knew him." At the Montana Wildlife Research Station, the staff struggled to function. Thomas's desk sat empty, personal items already collected by law enforcement. Colleagues who'd worked beside him for years questioned everything. Had there been signs? Should someone have noticed? One researcher broke down during an interview. "I had coffee with him last week. We talked about the spring elk count. He seemed normal." How was he normal? The search and rescue team held an emergency meeting. 12 of them had searched alongside Thomas in 2010, had trusted his wilderness expertise, had considered him a dedicated volunteer. Now they understood he'd been managing the search, subtly steering teams away from the area where Marcus was buried, participating in the deception while appearing to help. "I feel sick," said Kevin Ross, who'd coordinated search grids with Thomas. "Every suggestion he made, every area he recommended searching, was he manipulating us? Was the whole thing a performance?" At the First Presbyterian Church, Pastor Raymond Miller organized a community gathering for Friday evening. Over 200 people attended, the largest gathering since the initial search operations in 2010. Pastor Miller struggled to find words that made sense of betrayal on this scale. "We're angry, we're hurt, we feel violated. Someone we trusted committed an unthinkable act and then lived among us. Let us comfort him, let us believe in him. There's no easy answer for how to process this." Social media erupted. Facebook groups dedicated to the Marcus Chen case, quiet for years, suddenly surged with activity. People who'd participated in searches shared their shock, their memories of Thomas, their anger at being deceived. Some questioned how they'd missed signs. Others defended their trust as reasonable. How could anyone have known? Local media coverage was constant. The Montana Standard, the Billings Gazette. Even national outlets picked up the story. Wildlife biologist arrested in colleague's 12-year-old murder. Thomas's photograph appeared everywhere, the same quiet, unremarkable face that had been part of Copper Ridge's landscape for 2 decades, now seen through the lens of horror. Some community members defended Thomas initially, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the charges. There has to be more to the story, they insisted. Thomas isn't violent. Maybe it was an accident. But as details of the forensic evidence emerged, the strangulation, the deliberate burial, the 12 years of concealment, even defenders fell silent. For those who'd been suspicious of Thomas during the original investigation, vindication came mixed with regret. "I always felt something was off about him," one former volunteer admitted. "But I couldn't articulate why, and without evidence, you can't accuse someone. Now I wish I'd pushed harder." The memorial bench near the research station became a focal point. People left flowers, notes, candles, not just for Marcus anymore, but processing the revelation of who killed him. One note read, "Marcus, we're so sorry. We trusted the wrong person. We're so sorry." Children asked questions parents struggled to answer. How do you explain to a child that someone they've seen around town for years is a murderer? How do you restore their sense of safety in a community that's been violated twice, first by the crime, then by the deception? Copper Ridge's population of newcomers, those who'd moved to town after 2010, had a different reaction. They'd known the Marcus Chen story as history, not lived experience. Now they understood what longtime residents meant when they said the case had changed everything. "We moved here because it seemed like a safe, tight-knit community." One new resident said, "Now we're learning it's a community that's been living with a killer for 12 years. Robert Chen received calls from Copper Ridge residents, apologies, expressions of shame that their community had harbored his son's murderer, offers of support that felt inadequate in the face of such profound betrayal. Robert accepted these calls with grace, understanding that Copper Ridge was also a victim of Thomas Brennan's choices. By week's end, Copper Ridge had entered a new phase of collective processing. The question was no longer what happened to Marcus Chen, but how do we live with knowing what happened and who did it? The town would need time to heal from this revelation, perhaps more time than it had needed to learn to live with mystery. Trust, once broken by disappearance, had now been shattered by betrayal. Copper Ridge would survive, small towns always do, but it would never be quite the same. The state of Montana v. Thomas Russell Brennan began on September 12, 2022, 6 months after Thomas's arrest. The trial was held in Helena at the Lewis and Clark County Courthouse, Judge Patricia O'Neill presiding. The proceedings would last 8 days and deliver answers that had eluded justice for over 12 years. Jury selection took 2 days. The pool was questioned extensively about knowledge of the case. Nearly everyone in Montana had heard about it, an ability to remain impartial. 12 jurors and 2 alternates were eventually seated, their faces serious as they understood the weight of what they'd be deciding. Prosecutor David Chen delivered his opening statement on September 14th. He stood before the jury, Marcus Chen's photograph displayed on a screen behind him, and laid out the state's case methodically. On January 8, 2010, Marcus Chen left work planning to drive home. He never arrived. For 12 years, his father searched. For 12 years, this community wondered. For 12 years, one man knew exactly what happened, because he was the one who killed Marcus Chen, buried his body in the wilderness, and then joined the search efforts to help cover his tracks. The prosecutor outlined the evidence. GPS data from Marcus's phone showing he'd been at the burial location, DNA evidence linking Thomas to fibers on Marcus's clothing, forensic evidence of strangulation, the letter found in Thomas's home confessing to the killing. The defendant made a choice that night. Instead of calling for help, instead of accepting responsibility for what happened, he chose murder. Then he chose deception for 12 years. Defense attorney Daniel Morrison presented a different narrative. He didn't deny Thomas's involvement, the evidence made denial impossible, but argued the killing was unintentional, the burial a panic response to an accident gone wrong. Thomas Brennan is not a murderer, he's a man who made a terrible mistake and compounded it with terrible decisions driven by fear. Yes, Marcus Chen died that night. Yes, Thomas buried his body, but this was not premeditated killing. This was a tragic confrontation that escalated beyond anyone's control, followed by choices made in panic that Thomas has regretted every day for 12 years. The prosecution's case unfolded over 4 days. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the medical examiner, testified about Marcus's injuries, the head wound, the strangulation, the timeline suggesting deliberate action rather than accident. Crime scene technicians explained the burial site, the effort required, the deliberation it demonstrated. The DNA evidence was presented by forensic specialist Dr. James Patterson. He walked the jury through how epithelial cells from Thomas's skin had transferred to flannel fibers, how those fibers ended up on Marcus's clothing, how the DNA profile matched conclusively. The probability of this DNA belonging to anyone other than Thomas Brennan is 1 in 47 trillion, Dr. Patterson testified. Sarah Hutchins took the stand on day 5, walking through the entire investigation. The initial search, the years of dead ends, the breakthrough with GPS data, the discovery of Marcus's body. She described finding Thomas's unsent letter, the confession it contained. The defense objected to the letter's admission, arguing it was uncorroborated and potentially inadmissible, but Judge O'Neill allowed it as evidence of Thomas's state of mind. Robert Chen testified on day 6. He spoke quietly about his son, about 12 years of searching, about the betrayal of learning Thomas had been involved. "I searched with him," Robert told the jury. "Thomas Brennan helped me look for my son. He knew where Marcus was the whole time. He watched me search and said nothing." The courtroom was silent. Several jurors wiped tears. The defense called Thomas Brennan to testify on day 7. It was a calculated risk. Putting the defendant on the stand always is, but Morrison believed the jury needed to hear Thomas's explanation directly. Thomas took the stand wearing a suit, looking older than his 54 years. His voice was steady, but emotion flickered across his face as he described January 8, 2010. "Marcus had discovered errors in my research, significant errors that would have ended my career if they became public. I'd made mistakes in data collection over several years. Marcus was meticulous. He found the problems. We argued that night. I asked him to meet me to discuss it privately. We drove to the access road off Highway 12. "What happened there?" Morrison asked. Thomas's voice cracked. "We argued. Marcus said he had to report the errors to the station director, that scientific integrity required it. I pleaded with him to give me time to fix it myself. He refused. I grabbed his arm. He pulled away and fell, hit his head on a rock. He was dazed, bleeding, and I panicked. What did you do?" "I thought about what would happen if we went to the hospital. The questions, the investigation into why we were there, my errors would come out anyway. I'd lose everything, so I made the choice. I put my hands on his throat. I told myself I was just keeping him quiet while I figured out what to do, but Thomas stopped. Composing himself, "I killed him, I strangled him. It took less than a minute. Then I buried him and went home." The courtroom was absolutely silent. "Why did you join the search efforts?" Morrison asked. "Because I couldn't stay away. I needed to know if anyone suspected. I needed to make sure the search went where I wanted it to go." And Thomas paused, "because part of me wanted to be caught. Carrying that secret was destroying me." Cross-examination was brutal. Prosecutor Chen attacked every element of Thomas's story, highlighting the premeditation in choosing the remote location, the deliberation in digging a grave, the calculated deception in joining search efforts. "You claim this was panic, Mr. Brennan, but you spent hours digging a grave in frozen ground. That's not panic, that's planning." "I was in shock. I wasn't thinking clearly." "You thought clearly enough to bury the body where it wouldn't be found for 12 years. You thought clearly enough to start documenting the search before Marcus was even reported missing." "This was murder, Mr. Brennan, not an accident." Thomas had no good answer. Closing arguments came on day 8. The prosecutor was concise. "Thomas Brennan killed Marcus Chen to protect his career and reputation. Then he spent 12 years deceiving everyone who loved Marcus, participating in a search for a man he knew was dead. This is murder. This is obstruction. This demands justice." The defense argued for sympathy. "Thomas Brennan made terrible choices. He will live with those choices forever, but he is not a cold-blooded killer. He is a man who made one catastrophic mistake and has suffered every day since. The law allows for degrees of homicide. This is manslaughter, not murder." The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. Judge O'Neill read the decision in a courtroom packed with media. Copper Ridge residents and Robert Chen sitting in the front row. "In the matter of the state of Montana versus Thomas Russell Brennan on the charge of second-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant guilty. On the charge of tampering with physical evidence, we the jury find the defendant guilty." Thomas showed no reaction. He simply bowed his head. Sentencing was scheduled for October 15th. As Thomas was led from the courtroom, he glanced once more at Robert Chen. No words passed between them. None were needed. On October 15, 2022, Robert Chen stood before Judge Patricia O'Neill to deliver his victim impact statement before Thomas Brennan was sentenced. At 76 years old, Robert had spent 12 years of his life searching for his son. Now he would speak the words he'd imagined saying if he ever found Marcus's killer. "Your Honor, my name is Robert Chen. Marcus was my only child. When he disappeared in January 2010, I thought the worst thing that could happen was never knowing what became of him. I was wrong. The worst thing was learning that someone I trusted, someone who helped me search, someone who looked me in the eye and expressed sympathy, that person knew the truth the entire time. Robert's voice remained steady, though tears ran down his face. Thomas Brennan took my son from me twice. First, when he killed Marcus. Then every time he helped me search, every time he offered condolences, every time he pretended not to know. I searched hundreds of miles of wilderness. I spent my retirement savings on private investigators. I aged 12 years carrying hope that became torture, and Thomas Brennan watched. The courtroom was silent except for Robert's voice. I don't know if I can forgive him, maybe someday, but today I want justice. I want accountability. I want Thomas Brennan to understand that his choices destroyed not just Marcus's future, but mine as well. My son would be 46 years old now. I should have grandchildren. I should have watched Marcus earn his PhD, advance his career, build a life. Instead, I have a grave in Montana and memories of 12 years wasted searching for a man buried by someone who pretended to care. Robert sat down. Several jurors were crying. Thomas Brennan was given opportunity to address the court before sentencing. He stood, hands shaking, and spoke directly to Robert. Mr. Chen, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I made a choice that night driven by fear and selfishness, and I've lived with that choice every day since. Searching with you was both punishment and penance. I needed to see what my actions had done to you. I needed to feel the weight of my deception, but I couldn't tell the truth. I was a coward then, and I remained a coward for 12 years. Thomas's voice broke. I'm sorry, those words are inadequate, but they're all I have. I'm sorry for taking Marcus from you. I'm sorry for the years of searching. I'm sorry for every lie, every moment of false sympathy, every time I let you hope when I knew there was none. If I could undo that night, I would, but I can't. All I can do is accept responsibility now. Judge O'Neill considered the sentencing guidelines. Second-degree murder in Montana carries a potential sentence of 10 to 100 years. Tampering with evidence adds additional time. She reviewed the sentencing report, the victim impact statement, the defendant's statement, and the overwhelming nature of the deception. Mr. Brennan, you committed murder to protect your reputation. Then you compounded that crime by participating in an elaborate deception that lasted over a decade. You searched for a man you'd killed. You comforted a father while hiding that you'd murdered his son. This level of calculated dishonesty, sustained over 12 years, demonstrates a profound moral failure. Judge O'Neill pronounced sentence. For the crime of second-degree murder, I sentence you to 40 years in the Montana State Prison. For tampering with evidence, an additional 10 years to run consecutively. Total sentence, 50 years imprisonment. You will be eligible for parole after serving 40 years. At 54 years old, Thomas Brennan would be 94 before parole eligibility, effectively a life sentence. Thomas was led from the courtroom in shackles. Robert Chen watched him go, feeling not triumph but exhaustion. Justice had been served, but it didn't bring Marcus back. It didn't restore the 12 years Robert had lost to searching. It didn't heal the wound of betrayal. After the hearing, Sarah Hutchins met Robert in the courthouse hallway. We got him. Said, it's over. Robert nodded. Thank you for not giving up. For 12 years you kept this case alive. Marcus deserved that. So did you, Sarah replied. Robert flew back to Seattle the next day. Marcus's remains had been released to the family in August, cremated per Robert's wishes. Some of the ashes were scattered in the Helena National Forest meadow where Marcus had scattered his mother's ashes, reuniting them. The rest Robert kept in an urn in his apartment. Finally able to bring his son home. Closure is a word people use when they don't know what else to say. Robert had answers now. He knew what happened to Marcus, knew who was responsible, knew that person was in prison. But closure suggests an ending, and grief doesn't end, it just changes shape. Robert would live the rest of his life with knowledge instead of mystery. Sometimes knowledge was better, sometimes it was worse. Always. It was insufficient to fill the Marcus-shaped hole in his world. But he had one thing he didn't have before. He could visit his son's grave, speak to him, know that Marcus wasn't lost in the wilderness waiting to be found. That at least was a kind of peace. The Marcus Chen case transformed how Montana handles cold cases and missing persons investigations. In the years following the 2022 conviction, several significant changes emerged from the lessons learned. The Montana Department of Justice implemented mandatory re-examination protocols for cold cases older than 10 years. Using modern forensic technology to revisit old evidence became standard practice. The Marcus Chen case proved that advances in DNA analysis, GPS recovery, and digital forensics could crack cases that seemed unsolvable with earlier technology. The Chen Protocol was established, a systematic review process requiring cold case evidence to be retested every 5 years as technology advanced. 3 other Montana cold cases were solved between 2022 and 2024 using this approach: bodies recovered, families given answers they'd waited decades to receive. Training programs for investigators now include modules on the Marcus Chen case, studying how Thomas Brennan's participation in the search efforts nearly succeeded in permanent concealment. Law enforcement learned to be more skeptical of volunteers who seemed too helpful, too involved, too knowledgeable about where searches should or shouldn't go. The case also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence indefinitely. In 2010, some jurisdictions had policies for destroying old evidence to save storage space. Marcus's iPhone 3G, preserved for 12 years, became the key that unlocked the case. Montana now maintains permanent evidence storage for all unsolved homicides and missing persons cases, no matter how old. Victim advocacy groups use the case to push for better support systems for families of the missing. Robert Chen's 12-year ordeal highlighted how families endure not just grief but financial burden, psychological trauma, and systemic challenges in navigating long-term investigations. New programs provide counseling, financial assistance, and dedicated liaison officers for families facing prolonged uncertainty. The Montana Wildlife Research Station established the Marcus Chen Memorial Fellowship, funding graduate students studying wildlife biology with emphasis on ethical research practices. The fellowship's mission statement explicitly addresses the importance of scientific integrity, the very issue that led to Marcus's death. In Copper Ridge, the memorial bench near the research station was expanded into a small memorial garden, maintained by volunteers, a place for reflection on loss and the importance of truth. A plaque was added with Marcus's words from his final field journal entry: "Weather deteriorating. We'll continue monitoring from vehicle if conditions worsen." The dedication beneath reads, "In memory of Marcus Chen, whose dedication to truth cost him his life." The case entered criminal justice textbooks as a study in how guilt concealment manifests over time. Thomas Brennan's 12 years of deception, his participation in searches, his integration into the victim's family's grief, these became teaching points for understanding criminal psychology and long-term deception. Most significantly, the case demonstrated that justice delayed is not justice denied. 12 years between crime and conviction was extraordinarily long, but the persistence of investigators like Sarah Hutchins, the advancement of forensic science, and the preservation of evidence made resolution possible. For Robert Chen, the legacy was more personal. He established a small foundation supporting search and rescue operations in Montana, ensuring volunteers had proper equipment and training. The foundation's motto, chosen by Robert, was simple: never stop searching. By 2024, the Marcus Chen case was no longer about mystery. It was about memory, about lessons learned, about the systems that failed and the systems that eventually succeeded. It was about a young biologist whose dedication to truth led to his death, a father who never stopped searching, and an investigator who refused to let the case go cold. Marcus Chen's story would be told for generations in Montana, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mountain winters or remote research work, but as proof that even 12 years of silence can be broken, that even the most careful concealment can eventually fail, and that some people care enough about truth and justice to keep searching long after hope seems rational. This case proves justice can come even after 12 years. Make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates true crime stories. Your support helps bring attention to cases that might otherwise be forgotten. What cold case do you think deserves more attention? Comment below. Every unsolved case represents a family still waiting for answers, still hoping for the closure that finally came to the Chen family after nearly 12 years of searching.